Hey, this is Scott Allen Miller on IT, Sam IT here on YouTube. And today I want to talk to you about how Microsoft is not crazy. This is a weird one. And I don't come from like a real strong Microsoft background. A lot of people are always like, oh, you do Linux and you do all these things, you're not into Microsoft. But the reality is I like to work all across the industry. I like working with lots of products, and Microsoft is a great company that makes a lot of great stuff, right? And they have for a long time. And something I've found, though, which is weird to me, and I found it a lot actually, is that in working with people, especially people who work with Microsoft products a lot, people who specialize in Windows, people who do a lot of desktop support, there's a tendency towards a belief that Microsoft has completely gone insane in weird random ways. And it comes up at the weirdest times. And I can give weird examples over time, but I've got one that I like a lot. And it was a number of years ago, I worked with a guy who was an MCSE Plus I, right? This is the highest level of certification Microsoft has ever offered in their systems and engineering and administration tracks, right? There's the famous MCSA and the MCSE, and then the MCSE Plus I was 50% more work than the MCSE. This is a pretty serious certification. I've only known 2 people to have it in my entire life. There's only like 1,000 people I think that's ever had it. Not sure, but it was a small number. And for one of these people who spends all of his time working in Microsoft, all of his time on Windows, doesn't do anything else, doesn't touch anything, swears up and down, would never consider working in any other environment. And yet, when it comes to something really basic, and he has a problem, in this case, he had a problem with getting a time zone correct, instead of saying, oh, I must be getting the time zone incorrect and fixing it or looking for how he was getting it wrong, which turned out he just didn't know what the time zone was, his response was to believe that Microsoft was making software that couldn't tell time. He thought that universally there were whole parts of the globe for which Microsoft products, Windows specifically, could not tell the accurate time at all. This is crazy. He actually thought that the largest software vendor the world has ever known, who makes almost entirely business software, whose primary platform and product and moneymaker and the basis for their empire is Windows, would not be able to get their clock to work correctly. And this isn't like, oh, the NTP protocol is really complex. This isn't, oh, they're trying to do something that's groundbreaking. No, he just thought that they got one of the time zones off by a few hours and couldn't figure out how to get it to work correctly. This is something so basic that it's simply unthinkable to believe that someone like Microsoft would have a blunder to such a degree, and he believed that it had been left in for decades, that it had come from some very old version of Windows and had lingered on forever. Of course, once you looked at it, you could easily just look and see that he had the wrong time zone, put in the right time zone, and fixed. But that his response, and I've had this from a lot of people, that instead of simply saying, oh, something must be wrong, there must be a misunderstanding, they jump to the conclusion that Microsoft, of all companies, has completely lost their mind and is doing something crazy. Mostly we see this in lesser conversations, right? Licensing is a big one. People, well, Microsoft doesn't understand licensing and did something crazy. That's probably not true. Yeah, you may not agree with everything that Microsoft does. You may not love all their products. You may not even use their products, but you can pretty safely assume every time that Microsoft has put a lot of research into it, they've thought hard about it, and it probably makes sense to them, or it's something that is so hard to get right that they had to guess and maybe they got it wrong, or they're in the middle of doing market research and you're one of the people that's kind of being hit by that. That stuff happens, right? The Metro interface on Windows 8, we all talk about how terrible it was, but the reality was they were testing some things and they were preparing us for new products after that. They have a much bigger game plan than people give them credit for. Vista was actually a great product, and it did exactly what it needed to do. It got people adjusted to the new interface so that a few years later they could bring out Windows 7 and everybody thought it was the best thing ever. And it was a great product. But it wasn't that much better than Vista. If you went back and looked at Vista after it was patched and after you'd gotten used to it, you'd realize, oh, Windows 7 was just a very small tweaking of later Vista. Vista just took a lot of heat because it did a lot of changes, a new kernel, a new interface, a bunch of new things like UAC were all brought out all at the same time. People were shocked. They got upset. They don't like change. Vista took the blunt of that. so that Windows 7 could be a huge success, even though it didn't do that much differently. It was a great product, no question about it, but it just wasn't the groundbreaking product that people think it was, and Vista was not the pariah that it should have, or it shouldn't have been the pariah that it ended up being. But Microsoft knew that that was going to happen, and that's why they release products that way. They're not crazy, they're not clueless, they do make mistakes, but not those kinds of mistakes, or not very often, and they're certainly not doing these things without thinking about them. They're putting a lot of thought into them. So when working with Microsoft or working with other companies like this, IBM, Dell, these are big companies with huge track records. They know what they're doing. Do they make mistakes? Yes. But don't assume that a company like this, with the amount of research and effort and resources that they put into things, is crazy. Assume that somewhere, if it seems like they're crazy, that you've missed something. Either you've missed what their customers are demanding, you've missed how to use the product correctly, you've missed that this is something that they're selling rather than something they're suggesting. There's a lot of different reasons why things may or may not make a lot of sense. Or with Microsoft licensing, it may seem complex, but if you think about how you need to deploy it in different scenarios, the reality is Microsoft does a great job of keeping their licensing pretty simple. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. If you were to actually design a common sense licensing scheme that had to work with the kind of scenarios that Microsoft has to deal with, especially for like Windows and SQL Server and those kinds of products on a day-to-day basis, they need licensing more or less as they have it. And if, sure, some things are somewhat arbitrary, like you get 2 VMs or you have a minimum of 16 cores. If you were designing it yourself, you may have picked 8 cores or 24. But those are just the numbers. The actual framework of the licensing scheme would probably be pretty close if you were dealing with the factors they are dealing with, and most of those are pretty obvious ones if you stop and empathize with how they need to interact with different kinds of customers around the world. So, as an IT trick, one, don't assume big vendors are crazy just because it seems like you're complaining and the chances that they are is just very, very low. And two, it will help you find where you may be the one making the mistake, whether it's you didn't look up time zones and you didn't bother looking up time zones because you were so sure that Microsoft would just get it wrong. No. Or you just weren't sure where to look for the right information, or you approached it wrong because you're making this assumption. Take that assumption out. Make them prove that they did something crazy if that's the case. So don't jump to that conclusion, because it's almost certainly not true, and you can definitely assume that they put effort into trying to get it right. Thanks for watching. I'm Scott Allen Miller, and this is going to be posted, and of course, as always, links in the notes on the mangolossy.it community, where you can discuss why you think Microsoft is crazy, or why I'm crazy, or how great Windows is, or how Linux is taking over the world, and all that kind of stuff, and why you don't like licensing. I'm going to do a video on licensing, though, because I actually think Microsoft licensing is good, or pretty good. And like and subscribe. We'll have hopefully a video more or less every day.